Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mom's Writers Club. Please give us a quick like and subscribe so we can reach more viewers like you. I am Jessica.
And I am Sarah.
And today we're going to talk about how autobiographical our characters and or books are or are not. This was a recent conversation piece during one of our every other Wednesday Mom's Writers Club chats over on Twitter, which anyone is welcome to join. And we just decided it might make kind of a fun conversational episode. So this is totally unscripted, just Sarah and I kind of going back and forth about it.
So I feel like readers are very interested in this question.
Yeah.
And they don't always ask it exactly this way, but there's always some version of, is this based on things from your life? Is this I think they're really interested in like what part of you did this come from? Like
Mm-hmm.
this whole story came from in your brain. And and I want to know where it came from. My sister actually went to when we were talking. So I just had my book come out. Johanna Porter's Not Sorry, available everywhere. Um, and right before I did, look at that. It's right there on your desk. Um, before I did my couple of book events, we were talking. My sister, we were like talking through like what questions might I get, and she said she went to this book event with the guy who wrote All the Light We Cannot See. And she said it was so like one of the most interesting parts of it for her as a reader was when he talked about like these events in his childhood and in his growing up that kind of led him to write this particular book. And she was just really fascinated by that. I think readers really want to know. And there is not a simple answer to that question.
I agree. There's not a simple answer, but I also think it really depends because, well, we'll get more into it. But for me, it
Yeah.
varies by book. But I agree. I'm so interested in that. Like, I hear the question and I'm like, but then I start thinking about the books that I like grew up loving and the books that I feel like I still hold in my heart or that have kind of become a part of me. And you also find yourself interested in the author, especially as a
Mhm.
writer. Um, Pause. Okay. Sorry, everyone. My child is actually under my desk as we're recording this.
I
My
love it.
mom.
Hashtag. All
Oh,
right.
we've reached a new level of friendship. We're filling each other's sentences.
Great.
Okay. So anyway, yeah, it's one of those things that as an author, it actually is, it depends. I've been asked that question in a way that has almost I feel bad saying this, but has been like borderline offensive. But
Like
at the same,
intrusive. Yeah.
yeah, it has felt intrusive before, but I think it was more the way it was worded.
Mm.
Or it might have been, it was about Make Me Disappear, which has some like domestic abuse in it. And I think it was the way it was worded around that specific issue,
Mm.
now that
Hmm.
I think of it. But I also think it's a really interesting question that people are interested in knowing about. And I don't think in general there's anything wrong with asking that question if it's
No,
done
not at all. No.
respectfully.
Okay. So if somebody asked me that question right now, Sarah, is this book real? Is this about you? You know, I don't mean, that sounds like teasing. And
But
I'm
and
not.
I'll do it. So Sarah, how autobiographical is Johanna Porter is Not Sorry? Is that good?
Yeah, that's good. So I think all books by all authors are autobiographical to some extent.
I
Some
agree.
part of them, I mean, they do. They come out of your brain and your emotional life and your life experience and the stuff that you're interested in. So, the answer is yes, like always yes. 100% yes. What that means, like what part of my autobiography does this come from is sort of the more maybe that's more what the question means. And I think it's different, like for every book. I am only on my third book. It's either my third book or my fifth book, depending on how you count them. Um, so it's starting to establish a little bit of a pattern that I can sort of look at and think about, but I think they're all different. But all of them are examining something that is of great sort of emotional interest and import to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to put it. And I would agree that every book is autobiographical in some way. And that doesn't mean that it's about you or that it is necessarily your truth. It might even be a truth that you observed and that you've thought about for someone else and that you've processed and, seen through your own lens.
Mhm.
But whether
And that
it's,
you and
yeah,
that you find interesting and important for some
yes,
reason.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's a part of you. So yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I am on my fifth or eighth book, depending on how you look at it. And I think it's absolutely true. There are some books that carry more parts of me or more important parts of me than other ones, but there are bits and pieces, whether it's part of the main plot, something the character has experienced, the emotion that the character
Mhm.
feels as the result of something. Sometimes it's a little bit or piece of a side character, that
Mhm.
reminds me of that character shares something in common with someone in my life, whether good or bad.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I was thinking about the three books I have. Two are published and one is about to be published. Make Me Disappear was my debut, and there were a lot of very autobiographical things in that, and I was very clear about that in the acknowledgments. And or maybe it was the letter to the reader, just talking about bad relationships,
Mhm.
and then there are little things that were autobiographical, like moving to the Seattle area as a 20 something and what that is
Right.
like. Whereas, my second book is not at all, well, I was gonna say it's not at all autobiographical. The character isn't, but it was a situation that I heard a podcast about and read about, and that was really interesting. But the character herself does have similar interests to, interests I've had.
Mhm.
And then the third book
And your
isn't
second
like,
book takes
yeah,
place where you grew up.
yeah, that's true. It
And
takes place where I grew up, and I wrote it during and right after COVID. And it was cool because while I couldn't go visit that place, it was kind of like visiting it in my head.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think most books have autobiographical components.
Yeah. Like my book that just published, it takes place in Washington, D.C. and a little house on the Chesapeake Bay, both of which settings I am intimately familiar with. It concerns a woman who's 43, and I was in my mid 40s when I wrote it. It concerns a woman reclaiming her creative life after, a period of doing all the other things that we do as women and moms. And that's kind of where I was in a lot of ways. So, there is a lot that was autobiographical about that. But let's not get too literal here. I did not hook up with a hot surgeon. Um,
Are you sure?
yeah, I'm sure.
Right.
Hot saxophone player. um,
Wait, did you steal priceless art?
I did not. I mean, of course, like we're pulling from settings that we know, or pulling from, well, I mean, your one book that you might have been working on recently takes place in a workplace that you are intimately familiar with. I don't know if we can talk about that book yet. Can we talk about
My
that book
third
yet?
book, coming out June 14th, is about a woman who is a nurse practitioner.
Yeah,
And
in a
yeah, so
hospital
it's based in the hospital.
and in a cardiac ICU, no less, right?
Yeah, and I spent a couple
Yeah,
years working in a cardiac ICU. It was a really interesting time in my career.
yeah.
Yes, I did
So,
purposely use the word interesting. That doesn't have a positive or negative connotation. Leave it at that.
right. So, in a way, like, of course, we do that. It's so much easier to get at the level of detail that really makes it feel real if
Yeah.
it's something that you've done in your life. I mean, it's so much easier. Otherwise, you do a ton of research.
I want to talk about that for a second. There's an
Yeah.
author, her name is Catherine Stedman, and each one of her books, she kind of does like a deep dive into a different career field.
Hmm.
And I mean, I don't know if
Oh,
she's
that's what I'm
picking
doing a
career
little
field.
bit.
Yeah, yeah, you are actually.
Hmm.
But I don't know if she picks one where like she knows somebody or like has intimate knowledge, but it's so interesting because you feel like you're also learning something at the same
Hmm.
time. Okay,
Hmm.
sorry.
Well,
Back
that's
to
like,
what we do know.
so my second book is about a woman who's like a super, like, high level mathematician.
Hmm.
Do I know anything about that? No, no, nothing, zero
But you
about
wouldn't
math.
know that from reading your book.
Right, but I'm fascinated by it, right? And I did a bunch of research, but I was really interested in math because when you're at that really high level, that really like research, that really almost theoretical research level math where you're like really pushing the boundaries of what we know and understand, it's so much like the creative process. It's so much like being an artist or a writer. And I was
Yeah.
just fascinated how like science like meets art around the back like that, you know? This whole thing of like being in a really kind of being really open and experiencing intuition and inspiration and taking risks and all the things. You know, there's so much in common with the creative process, which was part of why I was so fascinated by it.
So one thing that someone said, and maybe more than one person, but I'm looking at our chat right now, and someone mentioned having Easter eggs in their book that are
Mm-hmm.
there for people who really know them.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciate that because for me, it's maybe not people who know me, but like people who, for example, I poke fun at Portland a little bit in my third book, and I do it in a loving way because I love Portland. And if you're not from Portland or you haven't spent a lot of time there, you probably won't get it. But that's an aspect of something that's a little bit autobiographical that I can really appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you put Easter eggs in your books? I
Yeah.
don't think you do. Do you?
Sometimes not even that intentionally. Like
Yeah, that's fair.
for example, in this last book, oh no, actually in Johanna, uh, one of the very minor characters has the last name of one of my college housemates. So if he ever reads that book, he's probably going to recognize his last name and be like, that's my last
Okay.
name.
That makes me think of what I did in The Lucky One. In The Lucky One, if you have read a lot of craft books, you will recognize a lot of the names.
That's
Like the
great.
detective is named, I think it's Laura Crone,
Uh-huh.
reflective of Lisa Crone, who wrote Story Genius. One of the like one of the a character is named after, oh gosh, who's the guy? Jane Friedman talks, we should also mention the newsletter.
Mm.
Jane Friedman talks a lot about him. He did the Kickstarter.
Oh,
Brian
Sanderson?
Sanderson?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a character that's like Brandon Sanderson in the book because
So clever.
Not Brandon Sanderson, has a ton of YouTube videos. So he teaches at a
Mhm.
university, he teaches a creative writing class and he films it and just puts it on YouTube for free. And I've spent so many hours like watching or
Oh,
listening
I
to
didn't
those
know
videos.
that. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, there are a couple other ones in that book. I can't think of them offhand, but yeah, like anybody who wasn't a main character as I named them, it was totally based off of
Oh,
like a craft book.
I'm gonna do
And
that.
nobody's ever asked me about it. I
Oh
mean, now nobody can
no.
because I'll know
I
they
mean, I
watched.
noticed it when with Detective Crone. I remember
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But and I remember actually I remember when I read that book, I was like beta reading it for you and it was way back in the beginning before I had 50 craft books.
Them
And
early days.
probably before I had Story Genius. And I was like, this is a weird name. I don't know how to pronounce it. Like I'm reading this name and every time I come across this name, I'm like, I'm not sure how to say this name. Crone. Like maybe it's not a good name. And I didn't even realize.
That's so funny.
Yeah. We were chatting the other night over voice chat as we tend to do. And
It's our
at some
podcast.
and our ongoing daily podcast. And at some point Jess said something like, we are deep in writing therapy right now. And I thought about that for a second and I was like, I am always in writing therapy. Like that is what it is for me. Like writing is therapy. And I sort of looked back at everything I'd done and I was like, yep, like working out my deepest problems in
You
all
know
these
what?
books.
It's so true. And I'm going to go back to Make Me Disappear for a second
Mm-hmm.
because while what happens in that book is not at all what happened to me, there are a lot of similarities and I'm not afraid. I think I even put it in the letter to the reader. I did not realize how bad the relationship I was in my mid-20s was until I started writing about it.
Oh,
Because I remember
interesting.
thinking like,
Yeah.
oh, well, it's not like that person hit me. It's not like they never let me leave the house. It's not like they took an ID or a credit card away or anything like that. But I started like breaking down pieces of it. And as
Mm-hmm.
like a 36-year-old, 37-year-old woman, I was like, holy fuck. If I knew a 25-year-old who was like telling me about this relationship or
Mm-hmm.
sharing these things with me, I would tell them that it was that these are giant red flags.
Yeah. Yeah.
And somewhere in there, I realized I was kind of processing some of that
Yeah.
stuff that I just hadn't even like really thought about in that way, and just
Mm-hmm.
realized. And I think it's also a way,
Wow.
whether they are good things or bad things, to reflect upon things that have happened in your life or that you've
Yeah.
done. And it
Yeah.
can be a positive thing too. It doesn't have to be necessarily negative, but
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a positive process for me, even if it's
Mhm.
dealing with something that was a struggle. And actually, speaking of Lisa Crone, I remember fairly recently, like I keep all my notes for everything and in files on my computer. And at some point, I did some of the beginning of Story Genius for my second book about the mathematician. And it was long enough ago that I sort of didn't remember it. And I was reading through this and I was like, are these like the questions that like are these like the answer? I was thinking how to put this. I was thinking like, is this a sheet I downloaded with somebody else's answer on it? Because like this is really good. This is really like so clear and concise. And wow, I kind of want to write a book about that.
Isn't that
And it was
funny?
my thing. And it was about the why. It was about why are you writing this book? What is calling you about this book? And it was about being loved unconditionally and how that makes it possible for you to be the fullest expression of yourself and accomplish what you're really capable of accomplishing. And even if you don't get it in the beginning of life, you can still get it later, you know? Um,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, damn, yeah, like I really did need to write about that. And I think I didn't even realize it at the time.
Oh, one other thing I was thinking about with it is that, Sarah, you said this to me several months ago and it really stuck with me. And it was something like what's the common theme that runs through all of your books? And I'd never stopped to think
Hmm,
about it.
I said that?
You're like, I said that? You did.
I
You did.
surprised
Well, I
myself.
mean, because all of our books have different themes, right? But like, is there a common thread
Hmm.
behind all of it? And I write thrillers, which of course usually means that there's a character in danger. But I found that like one of the common threads that's present in all of my books is getting to a point where that person, which, okay, maybe you could say this for every thriller, whatever, but it's still personal for me, is that like you're at a point where you feel safe and like you're okay. I don't know. Does that make sense?
You mean like at the end?
Yeah, but not just like, oh, they didn't get me. I'm a Emma, honey,
Oh, uh-huh.
quietly. Yeah, but not just that they're like physically safe, but like
Hmm.
they are safe, they feel safe in themselves with
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah,
situation they're in or the people they're with. And that is something that runs through all of my
yeah,
books, I have
yeah.
found.
So at the end of thrillers, is it,
Mhm.
do you feel like that's different to some degree for you from, I don't know, other thriller authors?
I do, because I think
Yeah.
not all thrillers are about that. And characters don't, not that all of my books end with people being perfectly safe or getting exactly what they want, but like characters often aren't safe and don't feel safe in themselves. Like some thrillers
Hmm.
are about revenge, which is like, well, how do you,
Right,
it's not
right.
even a thing that's really being considered.
It's maybe a fitting closing comment.
Yeah.
Is that when readers ask that question, I think it's useful for me to realize that they aren't really asking me, like they may be interested in whether I know the setting or whether, what experience I had that, led me to make it seem so real or whatever. But I think they're also really looking for that deeper answer, like my sister was talking about. Like, what was it in my life that sort of brought me to write this book and not some other book, you
I think
know?
that's a great way to look at it.
And that answer can go a lot of different ways. And, I think when readers are asking questions of authors, they're trying to get to know you, the author, but also you in relation to your book. Like, how did this come out of your brain? Why this book and not some other book? So I've come to
Yeah, I
feel like it's
really,
a really cool question, actually.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Because I could totally see myself asking someone that question, like where did it come from? Anyway, we would love to know your thoughts on, how autobiographical is your book, or is it not? Let us know down below. We have our Wednesday night chats every other Wednesday. We have a Discord channel. You can DM me on Twitter for a link to that. I am over there at author Just Payne.
And I am at Sarah Reed, author.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye bye.